Everyone's now really sedated and quiet. Good afternoon. How be? That's evidence that I'm from Accra. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Ake Arts and Book Festival 2017. So this is part of WOW, the Women of the World Ake collaboration. My name is Esther Ama, and I will be moderating the panel discussion with Paula, Paula, Bisi Adeleye Fayemi, and Jessica Horn. So I am here, only my second time in Nigeria. I am Ghanaian. I live in Accra. I'm a journalist, a columnist, a media communications lecturer, and a playwright. The work I do is called Emotional Justice, and it explores legacies of untreated trauma. So the way we're going to do this conversation is I'm going to set the scene for us, since our panel is called Feminism Across Borders, and then each of these brilliant women is going to introduce themselves and share with you a bit about their work in the context of this word, borders. Then we're going to have a 15-minute curated conversation that I will moderate, and then it's over to you. This is an interactive session, and we want you to have the chance to say as much and contribute as much as you would like. So, let me set the scene. Our panel is called Feminism Across Borders, and so we really want to trouble this word, borders. Like, if you physically think about what a border is when you're traveling, it's essentially an intersection. When you arrive at a border, you have to stop. It's a place of transition. Maybe you're going from one geographical location to another. It may have options for you to travel in multiple directions. It requires that you often identify yourself. There are papers that you have to deal with. So when it comes to feminism and borders, it's really about intersections. Where does your feminism meet your practice? How do you practice this thing that you call feminist and feminist life? What are the kinds of conflicts and collisions and crises you have had in terms of the work that you have done? How do you resolve them? How have you had to struggle? And what is your relationship to feminism? So let's start with introductions. I'm going to ask each woman to introduce herself, and let me start with the far right, Paula, lady in denim. Over to you.
Thank you, Esther. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'm still very, very excited to be at Ake. My name is Paula Dineo. I am a feminist writer and professor. My work is on a range of things. I teach, my discipline is African literature. And I work, so I'm a researcher. I'm a researcher and a teacher. That's my day job. But I'm also always interested in work that is not just located in the academy, but also how we think about. So I teach feminism, and I teach African feminism, and I teach. So it's in how I teach. It's often the content of what I teach, but I'm also interested, of course, in the interfaces of work produced in the academy and work produced in different other contexts, creative contexts, movement building contexts, and I'm not saying creative and movement as though they're mutually exclusive. In fact, I think the work of transforming the world, of revolution by necessity is creative work. I think as an African feminist, perhaps it's obvious for many of us, but I think, for me, it means that I'm incredibly suspicious of nationalism and nationalisms and borders, and I'm unapologetically Pan-Africanist. Which I think is a big part of certainly many of the African feminist work that I'm part of. I don't know if that's. Can I stop there?
Good afternoon, my people. Are you here? Sorry for the delay, and thank you for the coup. So my name is Jessica Horn, and I've always called myself a feminist writer, doer, and interpreter of the ordinary. A lot of people know me as the doer, so I've been part of women's rights, formal women's rights institutions and spaces for about 16 years. Really, my passion has always been the politics of the body, because we're born in our bodies. Our bodies are actually the only thing we ever have in this life. And so anything that happens in this world around power happens on our bodies. And so I've always been part of movements and collective work to try and reimagine what our bodies could be, to, of course, address violation in the context of violence and abuse, and also of HIV/AIDS, conflict, but also the possibilities of pleasure, of choices, of acknowledging our diversities. And I've done that in very practical ways, even though that sounds quite theoretical. So I've been part of the first African Regional Network on Sexual Reproductive Health and Rights. I was the coordinator. I've worked in human rights funding and philanthropy for about 10, 12 years. I helped to set up the first African LGBT rights fund, led by African queer people in East Africa, and also through other kinds of training and movement work. But I'm also a poet. And I love to engage in analysis, both myself and collectively, because I really think that we need to understand the problems we're dealing with in order to really tackle them. And so I write in many spaces. A lot of it is quite policy-oriented. But I wrote the first global study on gender and social movements, understanding how is women's rights and gender equality placed in progressive social movements. And it was 100 people participated in producing the content, and what was shocking is basically that women's rights was kind of almost nowhere in most social movements of this world. And so I think that's also partly why we're here. It's not going on about women all the time, or not going on about feminism all the time, but the fact that actually most people are not fully engaging and integrating this feminist agenda into the work, even if they say they're progressive or they're about revolution or transforming the world.
My name is Bisi Adebayo. That is how I am known in the global women's rights movement, in the African feminist movement. In Nigeria, I'm mostly known as Irelu Fayemi, wife of. And as I said yesterday, I've learned how to deal with those irritations sometimes. And there is some of it that I accept as well as the natural course of the implications of the choices that we make, and being comfortable with them as feminists. I have spent most of my life in the women's movement, working on two concepts that are important to me, voice and space. I was with Akinamama Wa Africa in London for nationality. And the work I did with Akinamama led me to a whole lot of work I did with young women across the continent through the African Women's Leadership Institute that we set up as a program of Akinamama, because we felt that post-Beijing, post-Cairo, and all those important milestones that we had experienced as a global women's movement and as an African women's movement, we needed to be able to prepare ourselves as young women. I was young at the time. We needed to be able to prepare ourselves as young women to take these ideas and these energies forward. So the African Women's Leadership Institute was that space where we used networking and information and training to support the next generation of African feminists, or contribute to the next generation. And then from there arose the issue of resources. Who had access to resources? Who determined what was important for African women? Who determined the priorities that we decided to focus on with the mobilizing and movement building efforts? And that's how I teamed up with two other African women, Hilda Tadria and Joanna Foster, who has passed away, to establish the African Women's Development Fund. And so in 2010, after 10 years with the African Women's Development Fund as the founding executive director, I'm still on the board, but I stepped down in 2010 from the executive position. I made another transition into being wife of. And well, I've been wife of this man for many, many years, for the past 28 years now. But that platform of being the wife of a governor from 2010 to 2014 taught me a lot about the significance of informal power, and how those of us who spend our lives in civil society or the women's movement need to learn about the things we don't know, and how we need to bridge that gap. after that space, after exiting that space, I was able to exhale and think about my next steps. So I'm very, very comfortable with where I am right now. A middle-aged woman, a feminist, being able to use her voice as she would like to, and also staying tuned to the conversations that are emerging around the issues that are important to us. And I'm a strong and unapologetic Pan-Africanist.
Okay, so I want to, this is our curated part of the conversation, and I want to ask 3 specific questions on 3 different issues. This combination, you spoke about body, Jessica. You talked about voice and space. And Paula, you spoke about the creativity and movements. That's going to be one of the questions. The second question is going to be about specifically your personal relationships to feminism and how they manifest in your worlds. Since we don't live in movements, we live in societies and communities and families. So what happens when your ideology collides with your community and your family? How do you wrestle and reckon with what you say you believe? And then the last part is going to be about feminist supremacies and the ways in which African women and African women's feminism finds its space and voice in this world that allows much easier access to information. Body, voice, and space. When we get to a border, that's the thing that is being assessed. Your body is being looked up and down, your voice is being assessed, and somebody is up in your space. For you, in terms of the practice of your feminism, how do you negotiate when your body, voice, and space is either being challenged or threatened? So you're colliding with the reality of the way the world works. And what you say you believe, your ideology is being tested. Do you have an example or a story that identifies how you negotiated that space and what you learned about the practice of your feminism in walking that particular journey? Let me start with Paula. Can I start with you?
Okay.
Yes, Paula.
Thank you, Esther. That's a big question. I think there's several examples, but I'll maybe share one that is a constant, right? And one of those contexts is I don't know if it's personal, because it happens in the workplace, but perhaps as I tell the example, it'll be clear why it's both personal and not so personal. And this is a context where, and I think this is something that happens very often in the context of institutions. So I work as an academic in a context on the African continent. So most people in the country that I live look like me; they're African women. But I work in a profession where I'm a tiny minority, and often this means negotiating 2 things. It means negotiating the fact that as a very senior woman in my profession, I'm not powerless. I do hold an enormous amount of power. But it also very often means that I have to negotiate the use of that power in contexts that are very artificial, right? Where most bodies in this high decision-making platform are white, predominantly white men, in a country that's predominantly black women. And one of the things that I've had to negotiate, or that I battled with recently, so it's about voice, it's about space, it's about, and in a context, of course, where there's enormous upheaval in higher education around tuition, around transformation, around, I'm South African, I'm a South African citizen, so I carry a South African passport. And the South African higher education landscape is incredibly untransformed in the 3rd decade of democracy. And so it requires very often negotiating the artificial notion of how to use your voice in areas where you know very often that you might very well get outvoted, right? So if it comes to a vote, this decision around firing students, around shooting students, which is what is happening again in South African institutions, around kind of fees must fall, and so on. And so it often requires having to, it's recently, so ordinarily I think, raise your voice, say what you think, be argumentative, be the crazy person in the room, say what you know, say it as many times as you need to. But recently it has occurred to me that sometimes this performance, which I embrace, also gives legitimacy to institutional cultures that are in fact counterproductive. What do I mean? So I say what I believe, because I'm not very good at shutting up about what I believe and what I think is wrong and power. But at the same time, you're in a room where there's maybe 2 or 3 or 5 of you out of 300 who think that it is unacceptable to shoot students, to have police on campuses, to have paid tuition in a country that can afford free tuition at higher education and so on. But you know, ultimately it's going to come. It's very...
No visa, no visa. No yellow fever. It's so romantic, guys. He's coming. Yeah, that's it.
Yes, because how are we going to see? That's okay. You know it's going to work.